Let's go back to type 2 civilizations that could harness the energy of a star like our sun. You've come up with some innovative ideas on how they might do that.
Yes, I have been thinking about that ever since the search for radio signals started, which was about 40 years ago. We began looking for radio signals, and of course Frank Drake was one of the pioneers, and he was the first one actually to look for aliens by using radio telescopes. And of course we've not found any, which is disappointing, but perhaps not so unexpected. We're looking now just within our own galaxy, but there's 1 trillion stars there, and so there's a lot of different places to look. There are a lot of different frequencies to look, and so we're just still beginning to search the galaxy, and this is a very lively program which is still going on. And recently we've been looking in visible light as well. In fact, there's a program going on right here in Princeton, run by Princeton students, looking for visible flashes in the sky that might be produced by alien friends and colleagues. And so we haven't seen any visible flashes yet either. But anyway, all these possibilities are still open.
So how might we detect a type 2 civilization that harnessed the power of a star? You've talked about infrared radiation as indicative of some of their technology.
Right. I mean, the original idea of looking for radio signals assumes that the aliens want to communicate with us. And so you're imagining that they see this promising planet which might be harboring intelligence, and so they beam their radio signals toward us in order to open communication. So that's the scenario. Well, I raised the question, well, suppose the aliens don't want to communicate, can you still detect them? And the answer is yes, because if it's a type 2 civilization with lots of population and lots of industry, then it has to dispose of waste heat. There's no way you can have a large population without generating heat, as we know in our own experience. And the only way to get rid of heat in the universe is to radiate it away in the form of radiation, which is actually infrared radiation. So all we have to do to detect them, even if they don't want to communicate, is look for their waste heat, which means use infrared telescopes, search the sky. So I proposed that about 40 years ago, and when time came when we actually had sky surveys with infrared telescopes, we've had several of those. And of course, the joke is that the sky is crawling with infrared sources. There are millions and millions of these infrared sources out there, which look just the way a type 2 civilization might look. So there's absolutely no reason to believe that they're artificial. These are all natural objects, as far as we know. In fact, they're young stars, which are still they're called cocoon stars, because they're surrounded with cocoons of dark dust. So what you see is the outer surface of a dust cloud heated from inside by a star. And that's more or less the same as an artificial habitat would look. If you had an artificial habitat surrounding a star, it would essentially be the same thing. It would be a cloud of orbiting objects bigger than dust grains. But from our distance, it would look more or less the same.
This has been called by some people a Dyson sphere or a Dyson swarm, but built by this type 2 civilization. How might that look?
Well, it would look the way they do look. I mean, it would simply be a dusty cloud of objects heated from inside, in which so we would see only the infrared light from the outside surface.
Why would a type 2 civilization build that, and what might it look like from their perspective?
Well, the type 2 civilization, I imagine, is just starts out living on a planet perhaps, but then spreads out into habitats in space. So it builds itself orbiting spacecraft and big orbiting objects, which just to give itself living space, where it can grow plants and use the starlight in order to run its activities. So gradually it'll fill up the area around the star with more and more of these objects, until in the end it surrounds the star completely. you have to have some sort of traffic control to avoid collisions.
So you have all of these things surrounding these, are in other words, trying to get as much efficiency of getting the power and radiation of the star captured.
That's it, yes, precisely. So you have to spread out around the star in order to use all the starlight.
You've also talked about the greening of the galaxy and Dyson trees. What are those?
Well, my notion is that the galaxy is very boring as long as it's dead. I mean, if you look at all these planets and stars we've discovered, they're beautiful, but still they're sort of boring. They all are just totally desert. They're big gas balls of gas, or they're big balls of rock or ice. All of them seem to be sort of boring after a while. And what bigger contrast from our planet, which is teeming with butterflies and birds. So I'd like to bring life to the universe and bring the universe to life. And I think that's what I call the greening of the galaxy, just sort of a metaphor for growing potatoes on Mars and doing all kinds of interesting stuff with life.
And you thought in detail about it. What would it take for a leaf to exist in an alien kind of environment?
Right. So this idea of growing trees is, of course, very useful for small bodies. If you look at the solar system, most of the real estate is not on planets. Most of the real estate is the accessible area. Planets have a lot of mass, but not very much area. There's the little things like the comets, which occupy the Kuiper belt out beyond Neptune. There are probably trillions of those objects, with far more real estate than all the planets put together. So when life spreads out, that's where it'll have to go. That's where most of the area is. So you can imagine life living on these little comets outside, where there's lots of ice and other chemicals which are suitable for life, but very little sunlight. So they've got to adapt themselves to a cold environment. But otherwise, they have all the necessary chemicals. So for that purpose, trees would be very helpful, because in low gravity, these are objects with very low gravity. So there's no limit on the height of a tree. Trees could grow to be hundreds of miles high, and the gravity is so weak they could just spread out in all directions to collect much more sunlight. So this comet in the end would look like a potato with a little object in the middle containing the ice, and then these long trunks and branches and leaves spreading out over hundreds of miles. So it could collect sunlight from a much bigger area, and it could actually maintain itself then quite happily, even in a cold environment.
So you've had this remarkable history of looking at the future in all of these categories, from the greening of our galaxy and its environment to the capturing of the power of a single star to a galaxy, to what happens to the far future, even beyond that.
Yes, and of course biotechnology, of course, is racing ahead, so that we will really be able to breed plants to do this kind of thing pretty soon. I mean, the way I talk about the domestication of biotechnology as being the next big thing, and that biotech will be domesticated the same way computers have been domesticated. So every house will have a genome writing kit and a genome analyzing kit. So we can write the genomes for our pet dogs and cats, or for our roses and orchids, and the farmers can use it for growing crop plants, and we can write genomes for potatoes to grow on Mars, and so I think this is coming pretty soon. So all these things will become far more practical just because of biotech becoming domestic.
This, to many people who read your material, is enormously exciting, but frankly, to the vast masses of people, to talk about the far future, what's going to happen thousands, millions, certainly billions of years, has absolutely no relevance. But it really should. We really should be thinking about the far future because it helps us today, right?
Well, I think it certainly is true that most people are living in a terribly small, inward-looking world, where I mean, especially if you look at America at the moment, I mean, it's amazing how inward-looking it is. People, very few people, including our president, have any interest really in what's going on outside the country, let alone what's going to happen thousands of years from now. And I mean, this inward-looking culture, which takes the next presidential election as the limit of our vision, that's to me one of the worst things about this country, and I would love to change it.
Well, why is it important for humanity, for all of us, to deeply consider these questions of millions or billions of years into the future?
Well, I don't know whether it's important. I find it attractive. I mean, to me, it is just to understand how little we are in comparison with time, in comparison with space, I think is fundamental to having any sort of realistic view. So, I mean, to me, it's just a matter of opening our eyes and sort of looking to see what's there. And people are walking around in blinkers.